last week. Just want to remind you again, it's a class called Raising Kingdom Kids. And that sounds like a parenting class, and it is a parenting class, but it's not just for you if you currently are raising kids. We would love to have you in that class if you have already been through the process and you've made some mistakes or you've done some things well that you want to share. Raising kids in the church is a community activity, right? We all need each other to do that effectively. And so we would benefit from your wisdom having you in there. So Jim Bledsoe and John Toy are going to team teach that. It's a lot of interesting points of discussion in that conversation. And so if that's of interest to you, I hope that you will join into that class. All right, we've been studying the week that leads up to the resurrection, right? The long walk to the cross, from what is called Palm Sunday to what next week we will talk about as Easter. We know what that means. We understand the reference. We started this way back in January 21st we started this, and we'll be going a little bit longer. Last week we took some time to just talk about the actual crucifixion of Jesus and to spend some time walking with Jesus along what has come to be known as the Via Dolorosa. It's a street name now, but it's a term that means the way of sorrows, and it represents the path that Jesus might have taken. And we tried to look not at the traditional route, but at the biblical route. And you can find along the way about a 600-yard journey that Jesus makes from his trial to where he ends up being crucified. And so following him on that journey was a powerful thing. And we got to think not just about the walk and the pain and the suffering that was involved in this journey and in the crucifixion, but also about a troubling question. And the question is, what kept Jesus on the cross? Because we know he didn't have to stay there, right? We know he had the power to come down. We know that anytime he wanted, he could, I don't know if he would have had to snap his fingers or speak it or wish it, I don't know, but he didn't have to stay there. He chose to stay there. Why would he do that? And so we investigated that a little bit, and we talked about the challenging realization that really there are three different things. I don't know if this is working or not. It's not. Three different things that kept Jesus on the cross. One of those was my sin, your sin, our sin. It was our sin that kept Jesus on the cross. He wouldn't have been there without the things that we have done in our lives in violation of God's law and God's will. So it was our sin. It was also God's mission, that God had decided he was going to offer us the chance to be saved, even if we maybe didn't even want to be saved. And so God's mission kept him on the cross. And finally, we talked about how it was Jesus' love that kept him on the cross. Because again, even with all of those other things, if he had decided he wanted out, he could have gotten out. But he stayed there for you and for me. Well, Friday, of course, ends with a man named Joseph of Arimathea coming to get the body of Jesus. Jesus is dead now. Joseph comes along to claim the body. He sees that Jesus' body is prepared for burial. He makes sure that his body gets inside of a tomb, and that all of this happens before the beginning of the Sabbath, which would have begun sometime around sunset on Friday evening in this last week of Jesus' life. And so all of that is taken care of, but if you step back and you realize the implications of that, what that means is that the Messiah is dead and buried. This is not how it was supposed to happen, right? This is not how it was supposed to work. This is not what anybody was expecting. Now, of course, you and I, we have an advantage here. We know that this was not the end. We have the benefit of hindsight. We know, for example, that next Sunday, as I mentioned earlier, next Sunday is Easter. Easter is a celebration of what is believed to be the actual anniversary of the resurrection of Jesus. And so it's worth commemorating that. And I think it's worth also us commenting on the fact that we are privileged to know what happens. We're privileged to live 2,000 years later and to be able to look back on the whole story, unlike Jesus' disciples that we're reading about in the Gospels, right? I've been spending some time lately kind of digging around in World War I. You guys know I like that sort of thing, and so it's a very impactful world event that continues to impact us today and that I just don't know a lot about. So I've been reading a lot and watching some stuff, and one author that I was interacting with lately, he said something that struck me. He was talking about when you look back on the last century, historians refer to the 1920s and the 1930s as the interwar years, because World War I ends 1918, World War II starts about 1939. You got about 20 years there, the 20s and the 30s. That's the interwar years. It's the years between the First World War and the Second World War. And we know that because we look back on history. Some of you, we have some members who lived through I don't think we have anybody who lived through World War I, but we got some folks who lived through World War II, some folks who remember that. But the thing is, if you lived through those decades, you didn't know that terminology. If you were living through the 20s and 30s, you were not sitting around going, this is pretty nice here, these interwar years. You didn't know that. Why? Because you couldn't imagine that there was going to be a second world war, because you didn't even think of the other world war as the First World War. You called it the Great War, or if you were really provocative and really thinking, you called it the war to end all wars, right? It was so terrible that nobody would ever have a war again. 18 million people were buried in that war. And so that's the context of the people who are actually living through it, that it's different than those of us who get to look back at it and know what happened next. And so we talk about that in many cases, in terms of what happened afterwards. I think as we're thinking about this event, Jesus' long walk to the cross, we know how things are going to turn out for him, right? We know what happens next. And that gives us a different vantage point as we talk about Friday. It gives us a different vantage point as we talk about Saturday. We cannot unknow the fact that Jesus today is alive, right? He's alive today. We know that. You can't take that and remove that from your brain. That's a part of how we process this. But what about those people who were living through it at the time, before Sunday? What might they have been thinking about? What questions might they have been asking? Because they didn't know what was going to happen on Sunday. They didn't know. They might have had ideas. They might have had theories. They didn't know. It is interesting to me that the day between, boy, that is just a mess. Sorry, it's not Winter's fault. It is something between Google Docs and I don't know. What that's supposed to list there is the 4 Gospels and the references to what has come to be known as Silent Saturday, the day between what has come to be known as Good Friday and Easter Sunday. And the truth is that the scriptures tell us virtually nothing about that Saturday. In fact, Matthew, there's a couple of verses. Mark has no reference. John has no reference. Luke has a verse or 2. And that's really all that there is. We have really just 2 brief comments from the Gospels. Let's see if this one comes up. Hey, not too bad. Luke chapter 23. The women who had come with Jesus from Galilee followed Joseph and saw the tomb and how his body was laid in it. And then they went home and prepared spices and perfumes, but they rested on the Sabbath in obedience to the commandment. That's about all we know about Jesus' disciples, as far as I know. Maybe I missed something, but that's about all we know that is a specific reference. There was a group of them that they were getting ready for Sunday, but they were getting ready by not doing anything. Because that's what the Jews did. That's what a faithful Jew did on the Sabbath day. You didn't do any work. And so as much as they might have wanted to do something, as much as they wanted to perhaps go be near the body, be by the tomb, they couldn't even do that. They were faithful Jews, these women. And so they were remembering the Sabbath and keeping it holy. Jews had been doing this since the day Moses came down from the mountain with the 10 Commandments. It was part of what they did. It was part of who they were. Interestingly enough, the other reference that we have to Saturday has to do with the chief priests and the Pharisees, the Jewish religious experts, right? The ones everybody was supposed to be following. Excuse me. And interestingly enough, they were not actually so concerned about the Sabbath. They were more concerned about something else. And so they spent a chunk of their day, and we read this in Matthew's gospel, Matthew chapter 27, they spent a chunk of their day in Pilate's face. They were concerned with the lack of security around Jesus' tomb. They wanted to beef things up a little bit. They wanted a few more guards. They wanted the tomb sealed. They had this fear. There had been this prophecy that the Messiah would be raised from the dead. And so they had this thought that, what if the disciples of Jesus just go by and they steal the body, and then they start telling everybody, well, he's been raised from the dead. We don't know where he is, but he's been raised from the dead. So we got to stop that. So they're disregarding their own Sabbath law so they can go talk to Pilate and get him to do what he wants them to do. And that's about it. I wonder with the disciples, I wonder on that Saturday if they would have appreciated having something to do. Have you ever been through like a highly stressful situation where you're facing a lot of anxiety? Sometimes the worst thing when you're in a situation like that is to not have something to do. You want something to occupy your mind. You want something to occupy your hands, something to keep you busy. Go work in the garden. Go mow the lawn. Go walk the dog. Go do something so that you're not just sitting there thinking about what just happened or what might have happened. And yet here they are. It's the Sabbath, they're really not allowed to do anything. I wonder if that was part of God's plan even. So what is going through the minds, for example, of these women as they wait for the Sabbath to end so that they can go back to the tomb and help to prepare the body? What's going through their heads at a time like this? What's going through the minds of the apostles? What are they thinking about as they process not only what has happened to Jesus, but how they responded under pressure? I don't know if you're a fan of the NCAA basketball tournament right now, but for the apostles in all these events, this was not their one shining moment, right? They did not look good when all this happened. I wonder what they were thinking about. I wonder about Jesus' mom. She just did the most unnatural thing ever, burying a child. Not just burying a child, but watching the child be tortured and killed in the worst possible way with her standing right there through the whole process. I wonder what was going through her mind. And we don't really know anything about Jesus' father, Joseph. We assume that sometime before his public ministry began, he probably died. So he's not in the picture. But we do know from Scripture, from Mark chapter 6, that Jesus has probably 4 brothers and at least 2 sisters. And so he's got siblings. What are they thinking about when all this stuff is going on? In fact, I wonder how many of the disciples are asking hard questions on Saturday as they sit and as they observe the Sabbath. I wonder how many of them are asking questions like, is this guilt ever going to go away? Because it doesn't take long before you start to feel guilty when you've messed up, does it? And so imagine the apostles in particular sitting around somewhere. Jesus is gone. Not only is he gone, but I let him down. I let him down in his time of need. I'm not going to get to apologize. I can't make this right. I can't go to him and ask him to forgive me because he's dead. He's buried. I denied him, if you're Peter. Or at the very least, I wasn't there for him when he needed me the most. And I had sworn allegiance to him. And there I was turning my back on him. I turned out to be a fraud. How will I ever get past that? Judas, of course, can't get past that. Why? Because he is so overwhelmed with guilt that he actually takes his own life. I wonder if any of those other apostles looked at what Jesus did and thought, I wonder if that will get me away from the guilt. I wonder if that will be the escape that I'm looking for. And again, we know the rest of the story, and that's a beautiful thing. And so we know that in John 21, later on, after Jesus is raised from the dead, he's going to have other encounters with his disciples and with the apostles. And at some point, he is going to forgive and he is going to reinstate Peter before Jesus goes back to heaven. We know that's going to happen. Peter on Saturday doesn't know that. We know that at the end of Matthew, Jesus is going to take all the apostles back up to the top of the mountain. He's going to give them the Great Commission. Seemingly all is forgiven. We know that. They don't know that. How do Peter and the rest of the apostles live with themselves on Saturday when Jesus is still in the tomb? And not knowing what's going to happen Sunday, will the guilt ever go away? I wonder how many of them were asking that question. I wonder how many of them were asking the question on Saturday, did Jesus' life really mean anything? I mean, did it really accomplish anything? Again, some of the stuff I've been looking at with World War I is interesting. One of the things that's fascinating to me, the treaty that officially ended World War I didn't happen until 1919, but there's an armistice day. It's the end of the war. A bunch of people get together in a room and they negotiate. November 11th, 1918 is the day in which they say, okay, we don't have a formal treaty, we haven't figured everything out, but we're going to stop fighting. And so that's been recognized as Armistice Day for 100 years. The thing is, the armistice was signed on that day, November 11th, 1918. It was signed at 5 o'clock in the morning. But when they signed it, when they formulated it, when they articulated it, they said it doesn't officially go into effect until 11 o'clock in the morning. And so between 5 o'clock in the morning and 11 o'clock in the morning, on the Western Front, more than 2,700 men died in battle because nobody thought to say, maybe we should put this into effect right away and stop all the fighting. That's senseless. Can you imagine being a family who loses somebody after the war is over? As senseless as you might even think the war is before that. And so, was Jesus' death senseless like that? Did they kill this guy for no reason? Was he really the Messiah? What exactly was even accomplished in those last 3 years? Did it matter at all? Did it make a difference? What was the point? What did it mean? I wonder how many were asking that question on a day like Saturday. I wonder how many were asking a question on a day like Saturday like this. Where do we go now for hope? Where do we find it? Who do we put our hope in? It's been in Jesus, and now he's dead. I think back to very early in my life. I don't remember 1968. I was 2. But I've read something about 1968. I believe you could argue that it was one of the most turbulent years in the history of our nation. Incredible things happened in 1968. In 1968, at the height of the civil rights movement, many people had put their faith in Martin Luther King Jr. He was the one who was going to solve these problems. He was going to fix everything. And then in April of 1968, he was assassinated. In 1968, at the height of the Vietnam War, a lot of people thought we need to get out of there. We need to disengage. And the guy who is going to do it is Robert Kennedy. And in June of 1968, he was assassinated. When the thing that gives you meaning in life and the person who gives you hope in life are taken from you, man, that is a pretty bleak situation, isn't it? What do you do with that? And that is the sort of thing that Jesus' disciples are facing on Saturday. And so who could blame anyone if perhaps they wondered to themselves, and maybe they even dared, we don't know, maybe they even dared to verbalize it. Maybe they even dared to say to somebody else a question like this: do you think he's really coming back? Do you think he's really going to be raised from the dead? Or is he just dead? You know, he said he would. This, by the way, it should be Matthew 16:21. He said he would. That he must be killed and on the third day raised to life, but now he's actually dead. And you know, we saw him bring other people back to life. We saw him perform miracles like that, but can a dead man bring himself back to life? Or if a dead man can't do it, is somebody else like waiting in the wings to bring him back to life? How is this going to work? I wonder at this point how many of Jesus' disciples believed that it was over. I wonder how many of them, that the disillusionment had already started to set in. I also wonder at this point how many of those disciples of Jesus were counting down and who believed and just knew, waiting for the third day, fully expecting that they were going to get up the next day and Jesus was going to be alive. I wonder how many of those there would be. And I wonder which type of person I would have been if I had been there. I wonder what questions I would have been asking if I had lived through Silent Saturday. Thankfully, it is soon to be Sunday. Sunday is Resurrection Day. On Sunday, questions will be answered. On Sunday, hope will be restored. On Sunday, the world is going to be turned on its ear and things will never be the same again. And I hope that next week on Sunday you will be here so that we can bring up the resurrection and talk about it and all of its implications. Let's stand together and let's sing.